So thank you so much for joining again. And if you have not already, please put your location, your name, and your pronouns if you're comfortable in the chat for those on Zoom and those in person. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started with the event now. So as y'all can see on the screen, essentially the agenda for today is going to be a panel till about 2:40, so for about an hour and a half. And then we're going to have a quick 20-minute break with just kind of like a networking. Y'all can get up, walks, go to the bathroom, stretch, things like that. And we'll end off with a bit of discussion about criminal justice and AI with some of the articles and resources that we've previously provided, as well as a way for y'all to continue the discussion once you go. All right, awesome. So we're going to start off with a welcome with Samantha Kleinfeld. So Samantha Kleinfeld is the Executive Director of Violence and Predictive Analytics at the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. So everyone, please give it up for Ms. Kleinfeld. Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Justice Education Project and Encode Justice for having me here today. As you can see on the screen, I'm Samantha Kleinfeld. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Executive Director for Strategic Operations and also work on a lot of violence and data and predictive analytics projects at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Our administration has been clear about its commitment to building a bridge between technology and public safety. Biometric technology, like all technology, is constantly evolving. It is commonly used in both the public and private sectors. The once metal detectors in our airports are now in most airports as body scanning devices. Many offices rely on hand scanning devices for entry and as part of time and leave tracking to complete payrolls. Doctors' offices incorporated hand scanning to facilitate patient check-in. Technology is also an essential and effective investigative tool in crime solving. We expect security footage when a crime occurred in an establishment that serves the public so that law enforcement and ultimately a jury can see what happened and identify who did it. We do, however, recognize that the limitations of certain technologies can result in harmful outcomes, particularly for people of color, women, older adults, and children. We understand that biometric data are highly sensitive identifying information, which, if improperly collected, used, maintained, or disclosed, may cause harms related to an individual's liberty and privacy interests. Our administration is committed to making New York City safer and more fair than it already is, and we are equally committed to ensuring that any use of biometric technology also protects the constitutional rights of all New Yorkers. Thank you all so much for convening today, because it is so important that we continue to have conversations about the intersection of artificial intelligence and criminal justice.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kleinfeld, for joining us today. So like Nancy said, the Justice Education Project and Encode Justice are hosting this event. And just a little bit about us, JEP, otherwise known as Justice Education Project, our mission is to educate, empower, and encourage the youth to take action in reforming the criminal justice system. And Encode Justice, otherwise known as EJ, is a youth-led organization that advocates for human-centered AI and civil rights under AI. Just to introduce each of the people who are organizing this event, I'll go first. My name is Marissa Syed. I'm the co-executive director of JEP and also the co-chapter lead for the New Jersey Encode Chapter. So I have a little bit of experience in both. I'll pass it off to Neha.
Hi, I've already been here a couple of times, but again, my name is Neha, and I'm the co-executive director of JP, along with Marissa. I'm going to pass it off to Shreya.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. I'm Shreya, I'm the New Jersey chapter lead of Encode Justice, along with Marissa. And I'll pass it off to Simkin.
Hi, I'm Sasha Worry, and I am the chapter director for New York Encode Justice, and I will pass it off to Gia.
Hello, I'm Gia Michelle, and I'm the New York Director of Political Advocacy at Encode Justice.
Shreya?
All right, well, we want to give a special thanks to Irene Kim, Sneha Rabanur, Vale Allegra, Kristen Crawford, Ava Gamboa, Ilana Serpaz, Sarah Saida, all of New York and New Jersey Encode Justice chapters and Justice Education Projects members. Now we will introduce the speakers for the AI and ethics panel.
So I am so excited because we have so many amazing speakers today. But right now we will start off by introducing all the panelists here today. First, I will start off with Jared Trujillo, who is the policy counsel at the New York City Liberties Union, where he focuses on criminal and juvenile legal systems. He is also an adjunct law professor, and he serves on the board of New York State Defenders Association and a steering committee member at DCRIM New York. Prior to his current role, Jared served as the president of the Association of the Legal Aid Association, the union that represents the majority of New York City's public defendant and civil legal and legal workers. Oh, but now I will pass it off to Shreya to introduce.
Another speaker that we have speaking with us today is Nima Giuliani. Nima Giuliani is the head of national security, democracy, and policy for the Americas at Twitter, where she works strategically to advance core company policies and also preserve AI ethics. She is also an adjunct professor at the University of Carolina Law School, where she teaches a course on technology and civil rights. Prior to Twitter, Nima served in a range of government and advocacy roles. She was a senior legislative counsel with the American Civil Liberties Union from 2013 to 2020, focusing on surveillance, privacy, and national security issues. In this role, she helped design and lead federal legislation related to a range of issues, including NSA surveillance, eCPA reform, face recognition, and consumer privacy. In addition, from 2011 to 2013, she was a political appointee in the Chief of Staff's office in the Department of Homeland Security, concentrating on national security and civil rights issues. She was also an educator at the in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Agriculture, and was an investigative counsel with the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. As part of her work with the community, she conducted investigations related to the BP oil spill, contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Recovery Act. Nima is a graduate of Brown University with a degree in international relations and with a focus on global security, and she received the Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School.
Thank you, Shreya. I now have the honor of introducing Dr. Chauhan. So as some of you may know, Dr. Chauhan is the Director of Scientific Outreach at the American Society for Investigative Pathology, and she's the Director of Continuing Medical Education, or CME, at the program at the Journal of Molecular Diagnostics. She's a leader of the Women AI Ethics Collective, program manager at she's a program manager, she's a biomedical researcher, expert scholarly communicator, a sought after mentor in the field of scientific research, scholarly publisher, and she's very special in AI ethics as a self-proclaimed AI ethicist, which I think is actually very cool. Especially for women and girls. She's an inspiration to me personally. She's a thought leader and an international speaker, as well as a strong advocate for adaptable and accessible healthcare, especially as a board member for the Society for Scholarly Publishing, and an invited board of directors for the Open Pathology Education Network and the Digital Pathology Associate Foundation. She is at the intersection of scientific research, scholarly communication, science policy, personalized education, and responsible tech and healthcare, as you can clearly see by her very impressive resume. Her vision is to provide equitable, personalized healthcare to all beyond geography and despite all barriers, socioeconomic, race, class, all of that. It's very important to make these barriers accessible. And as one of the 150 AI makers and analytics leaders and influencers in 2021, as well as one of the 100 brilliant women in the AI ethics list of 2022. She's really strove to do this. Sorry. The next speaker that we were meant to have was Miss Stafala. Unfortunately, she's located in West Africa and there was a storm, and she's unfortunately able to join us as her internet connection is out, but we will miss her and we will miss her perspective on this panel. I'll now pass it off.
All right, so next we're going to introduce Logan Stapleton. So Logan Stapleton is a fourth-year computer science PhD candidate at the Group Lens Lab at the University of Minnesota. He is currently a visiting student at the Human Computer Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, and he's done extensive research on the use of predictive algorithms within the child welfare and the family policing system specifically. So his most recent work found racial disparities within the Algorithmic family screening tool, which is an algorithm used to evaluate families around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And his ongoing work focuses on how algorithms verify surveillance and carcerality in the child welfare system. So he's actively looking to connect with impacted parents, adoptees, and any foster youth who might be interested in working to oppose these algorithms and imagining new technologies in order to support families in the system. So, of course, if you're interested, please reach out. And we're super excited to have Logan Stapleton here. Thank you.
Next, we'll be introducing Aaron Simkin. And Aaron Simkin reports on how technology can be used to harm marginalized people for the markup, an organization focusing on data-driven journalism, covering the ethics and impact of technology on society. His focus is on platform governance, online extremism, and regulatory policy. Before the markup, he covered online extremism for the Center for Investigative Reporting, where he launched the Hague Report newsletter and co-created the Hague Citizen Journalism Initiative. Before that, he was a senior staff writer at the Daily Dot and founding editor of Huffington Post, San Francisco Vertical. His work has earned various awards, including a 2018 Public Radio News Directors Incorporated Award and 2018 Webby Award. His work has appeared on the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Motley Fool, and Gizmodo. Now I pass it off to Gia to introduce Albert Fox.
First off, we are so sorry about the technical difficulties, but we hope that it will not be any difficulties in the future. We are so excited to introduce Albert Fox Hahn, who is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project's founder and executive director. He is also a practitioner in residence at NYU Law School's Information Law Institute and a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, Ashoka and TED. Albert started STOP with the belief that local surveillance is an unprecedented threat to public safety, equity, and democracy. Albert is a frequent commenter with more than 100 articles in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Guardian, Wired, Slate, NBC Think, Newsweek, and other publications. He frequently lectures at leading universities and speaks at leading technology governance forums. Albert previously served as an associate at Whale, Goschel and Manges LLP, where he served Fortune 50 companies on technology policy, antitrust law, and consumer privacy. Albert also serves on the New York Immigration Coalition's Immigrant Leaders Council, IEEE Standards Association, P3119 AI Procurement Working Group, and is an editorial board member for the Anthem Ethics of Personal Data Collection. He was also a founding member of the New York Immigrants Freedom Fund's Advisory Council. Albert received his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law and Policy Review, and his BA in Politics and Philosophy from Brandeis University. Now, Marissa, go into the panel.
Thank you so much, Gia. So thank you for joining us all, everyone. Now that we're going to get started, with a prepared panel questions. There will be a lot of time at the end for all of you to ask questions in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, so we can get started. Panel questions are right here. Okay, so we can go through one by one, and the first question being, in your own words, could you define algorithmic justice? Erin, I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so, great to be here. I think to me, this idea of an algorithmic justice is that in our society, we're increasingly asking computers and technical systems to make decisions. And those systems are making decisions based on data. And that data is a result of the world in which we live, and that world obviously. And by having the systems make these decisions, it entrenches those biases. So a number of years ago, I wrote a story about car insurance. And the story was looking at practices of car insurance company that was essentially unfairly charging certain customers too much for the car insurance. That way, all car insurance is supposed to be an accident. But we found this one company that essentially was taking people who are already paying for their car insurance, running through this technical system, and charging them more money than people less. And for you're probably likely to, if the price makes sense. And when we looked at the areas that this was most affecting, we saw this affecting people predominantly. Most significantly. And that's because people in these areas are often suspected because the roads are open. Park, garages, we're creating a system where people in these historically marginalized communities were being asked to the technical system to pay more for their car insurance because the system is so complicated and so complicated. People had no idea. And to me, that is the core of justice, is looking at all these interactive systems that we have and making sure that how to find that for safe data.
I think that Aaron answered that. The only thing that I think is, and really, I think Aaron said, is I think it's just incredibly important that we're thinking about this justice. But we have to recognize that the justice system is so important. I think it is. And when we have we call for a lot of people that watch model that think that there's some magic bullet solving crime or determining where this is going to happen. Adding technology to something just gives really racist policy legitimacy. I really wish that the person from Anna's office, I would love to have a conversation about some I've about the idea that there's office right now is limited to using data equity. Well, New York City has an incredibly racist state. That was incredibly racist without okay, before we did the I would probably, and I can tell you so being on the database had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with what you did. It just had everything to do with the color of your skin, who you live next to, if you live at night.
Thank you so much, Derek.
really quickly, I understand there has been some very technical difficulties from the Zoom attendee side. So we're just gonna, we are just going to see if the audio is coming through.
Sorry, I lost my place.
No, it was actually, I completely agree. I kind of want to add something really fast is I think these kinds of conversations are so important to have with the elected officials in office. Like you mentioned, I really wish the mayor's office, with Samantha Kleinfeld, I wish she could have stayed because I think if you had been able to mention this to her, it is likely that maybe they would probably give a politicized response, but I honestly think at least it's better to get that word out. So thank you. I want to pass it off now to the panelists online. Dr. Chauhan, if you want, you could start. What is your take on algorithmic justice?
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and I apologize for missing out some of the extensive stuff that Aaron and Jared might have already said. And since this panel is extensively covering advocacy, public policy, and civil research efforts in algorithmic justice and criminal justice system, I think I would like to bring in a healthcare lens to the conversation, just to complement the perspectives, especially for the folks who are able to hear everything so far. Historically, I mean, it's very unfortunate, but there has been a misrepresentation or underrepresentation, I must say, of the folks from poor socioeconomic settings or folks who have limited resources in our medical data sets, So when algorithms are trained on these disparate training data sets, they tend to misperform when they're generalized or scaled up and applied in real time to masses. Recently, along with several AI ethics colleagues, I published a case study on the misperformance of an algorithmic decision-making tool, which was launched by Optum, which is a subsidiary of United Healthcare, which is one of a major healthcare provider here in the US. So it prioritized patients based on severity of their disease. Instead, over time, the model trained itself to use cost as a proxy, and as a result, certain marginalized populations like Black patients were denied care. There have been instances of several drug trials in which Black populations and other minorities have historically been excluded despite being the vulnerable populations. So when we come to conclusion, the clinical trial comes into conclusion and a drug is put into place in the market, it doesn't have the desired outcomes when applied to the masses. There have been several instances of gender imbalances in training data sets and the launch of algorithmic tools that were trained on these limited data sets that performed poorly when they were implemented in the real world. There's a lot of evidence of racial bias in algorithms which have been used, and implemented to manage health of populations. Like, I can keep going on and on, but from the criminal justice system perspective, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system, we see a higher representation of marginalized communities, folks who have limited resources, they're from poor socioeconomic conditions. So when you start applying these algorithms, predominantly trained on data sets that exclude these individuals, you further incriminate them, as the models do not perform optimally in the real world data. And unfortunately, we keep propagating the implicit biases and exacerbating the existing socioeconomic divide and existing disparities. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to pass it off to Mr. Stapleton. Would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think building off that too, probably my perspective will mostly be on child welfare, but I'll give you maybe an example from where I'm from in St. Paul, Minnesota. I guess when I think of algorithmic justice, I oftentimes focus on injustices, maybe more critical perspectives as opposed to using them for really just purposes, I guess. So what I think of algorithmic injustices, so where I'm from, Ramsey County, St. Paul, Minnesota, in 2018 or 2019, the local county attorney's office tried to make a risk assessment algorithm to predict which children were likely to become involved in the juvenile justice system. Right, and so in order to do this, there's not a lot of data sharing across government agencies in Minnesota. So they tried to get contractual agreements to share data across agencies, including like school records, juvenile justice data, criminal data, some demographics and things like this, and then use some sort of like statistical or machine learning algorithm on that data to try and predict which kids are, going to get involved in the system. Right. This isn't exactly child welfare, but it's still kids and very related. And I think we can all you kind of guess where this is going to go. You're using like racially biased data and data from schools and things like this that, wasn't made to predict criminality or anything like this. And then you're using it to label kids as possible criminals with that data and with those algorithms. Now, thankfully, this algorithm never materialized. Once the community found out about it, there was like organizing, parents got together, teachers got together, and they successfully organized to stop the algorithm and stop this data sharing. But for me, like the work that I do and the things that I see, I think this is like one of the clearest examples of on the ground kind of injustices that occur from even trying to implement these algorithms and then imagining like where these algorithms will go, right? It's mass data collection and surveillance at the local level, and then using that in these kind of very fraught ways that are like thinly veiled scientific ways of detecting criminality or fraud or some sort of risk. That's what I see as like algorithmic injustices.
All of the resources that Dr. Trujillo is providing in the chat will share and follow up.
For those that couldn't hear that, Dr. Trujillo is sending some amazing links in the chat that I just want to highlight for a second. So if anyone is able to check them out right now, please do so. We'll also send them in a follow-up email. But in response to what Mr. Stapleton said, I completely agree. And I'm very glad that that effort was actually stopped, because I feel like basing programs off of school statistics that are clearly not meant for such things is a very problematic use of resources that can clearly be put in a lot better ways rather than criminalizing those students, helping them, just the community in general. I want to now pass it off to Mr. Khan. And I do want to add a quick note, if you guys could keep your answers just a little bit shorter, since we do want to have time at the end for everything. So go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm happy to keep it brief, because I think that algorithmic injustice is when we give power to algorithms, full stop. That when we look at algorithmic systems and how they operate, particularly how they operate in governmental spaces, they give force to bigotry, they compound injustice, they augment bias, and they make everything worse. And, while we've seen a huge investment from cities in investing in the rhetoric of equity and justice, as we heard a few minutes ago from our city leaders here in New York City, the reality on the ground is very different. And, as much as the city talks about wanting to promote equity in algorithms, the truth is that New Yorkers are being arrested and tried and convicted based off of biased algorithms today. They're being detained without the opportunity to spend time with their families awaiting trial because of algorithms today. And despite everything you hear, the reality on the ground is more injustice, not less.
Thank you for that. Mr. Giuliani?
Thank you so much. First, I really want to thank the organizers for putting this panel together. I feel very flattered to be included on this panel with such amazing co-panelists, given their depth of expertise. I'll also be sort of brief. For me, I'll talk about sort of algorithmic justice more from sort of the surveillance standpoint. And to me, it really means three things. The first is when algorithms and new technologies are used, the right for people to be free from persistent surveillance, right? Not to be afraid that their phone calls are being listened to, or someone is tracking whether they, visit a doctor or visit a best friend or visit an abortion clinic. The second is this notion that if your personal data is obtained by the government, it's done through a process, and it's done because there is some cause to believe that you've done something wrong. And I think paired with that is generally kind of procedural protections. This idea that you're not going to have your personal data go into the hands of the police unless there's a warrant or a subpoena or some type of process, that you'll get notice, that if you're ultimately prosecuted or punished, that you'll have access to information to rebut any conclusions that may have come from that data or rebut how that data was even collected. And then third and final piece that I also want to highlight with algorithmic justice is I think it means that when a new technology is being used, when decisions are being made through algorithms or new surveillance technologies, that it's being done with full transparency and the participation and approval of the public. I think one of the reasons we run into the problems we're running into is a lot of times new surveillance technologies are deployed in secret. The communities that are most impacted aren't consulted. And we really don't think through what the long-term implications might be, whether we're talking about face recognition, location tracking, or other new surveillance technologies. So that's really what algorithmic justice means to me in that field. And I look forward to talking about, some of the nuances of how this is actually operated in communities around the country.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. I think a lot of what you touched on resonates with Patriot Act and a lot of what many Muslims are feeling after 9/11, especially with the unreasonable searches of their data, their phone calls, all of that. Definitely having a right to privacy is very important. It's enshrined in our Constitution, and the issues with algorithmic injustices are preventing that in a lot of cases. And I kind of want to transition a little bit onto what specifically led each of you to decide to fight for algorithmic injustice. So I'll start off with Dr. Joan, if you want to begin.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. So my personal mission is equitable, accessible healthcare for everyone. So I feel like there should not be any discrimination, just given your ethnicity or your sex at birth or chosen sex or your socioeconomic background, that you are denied healthcare coverage. And there's so many parties that have embedded themselves into the healthcare ecosystem for their ulterior motives that data safety and security of our patients has become a concern. Like if you think about 23andMe and just think about the opportunities that these malicious parties can have if they have access to people's health, to deny them coverage or to raise the premiums for them to be treated for certain diseases. Geographies like China have now started capturing the genomic information for their citizens. And the kind of ramification that kind of work can have is, very difficult to explore and contain.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think another thing to resonate with data collection, especially when it comes to other countries, is the types of apps that are using. I know a lot of people might be familiar with TikTok, especially with our youth audiences. Make sure to check your sources. Where are you getting your information from? Don't just read things on the internet and believe it. So thank you for providing that perspective. Mr. Stapleton, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think honestly, personally, like for me, I'm pretty young. I'm also from Minneapolis, so probably everybody knows like Minneapolis police and the murder of George Floyd. For me, like there's a much longer history there in Minneapolis of police brutality, government surveillance, a lot of like, it's not a huge city, but there is a lot of like government corruption and just kind of messed up shit that happens. So for me, it's like I was raised as a teenager going to protests and a lot of direct action in opposition to those. And then I also like study technologies and math and algorithms as a PhD student, as a college student. So kind of my path into that is like both of those things put together, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Stapleton. Nima, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I never thought I would work on technology or anything related to algorithmic justice. I wasn't a kid who played video games. I didn't read comic books. I could barely start a computer without, it leading to catastrophic results. I really started out my career interested in civil rights. And, particularly post 9/11, I was very heavily informed by the experience that people in my community were having, right? The different sense of fear, relation to the government, the distrust of law enforcement, people who couldn't enter the country seemingly based off of arbitrary factors and couldn't even get answers to why these things were happening. Individuals who were pulled over or searched, whether they were flying or driving, for reasons that they couldn't explain and that somehow felt wrong. So that led me to civil rights. And I think if you're working on immigration, criminal justice, and a lot of other issues these days, it's really hard to separate that from algorithmic justice issues and technology issues because technology is being used in all these fields. So that's how I sort of arrived to this work. It wasn't because I had any interest in technology. It was because I had an interest in sort of fundamental rights around immigration, criminal justice, and broader civil rights.
Thank you so much. We're just gonna pass it off to Mr. Condex.
Sure. So for me, the backstory is like when I was 12, my two biggest hobbies were building computers in my basement and protesting the NYPD. And so I remember going to protests and having the TARU unit, the Technical Assistance Response Unit, with camcorders just scanning the faces of everyone in the crowd. And that was profoundly creepy. But I also remember as a teenager helping a family friend with a national prank where we pranked the media to think that artificial intelligence was being rolled out as part of the judicial process. And so we had something called the Solomon Project. And back then we helped convince, hundreds of outlets that this was real. And back then it was just so ludicrous that it was almost funny. And today it's actual criminal justice policy. And to me, that's a reminder of how quickly the absurd can become a true existential threat.
Yeah, no, totally. I can definitely resonate with that, especially like personally having to go to like protests, and that's actually the initial reason why I became interested in criminal justice. I know we were speaking about that earlier, but it's definitely a way to grasp the different issues within this topic. I'll pass it off to you guys.
Yes, so I think when we first got interested in this topic, kind of as an algorithm of the reporting that I was doing on issues around platform governance and social media platform governance. And I don't know, maybe like 2015, so I was working on a story about Facebook's story was achievement. Getting their account system did was taking down the payments in the stage. And one of the things that they had said that I thought was really interesting is I was, asking, okay, there are different terms, there are different relationships that happen to people based on their race. And, do you take that into account when someone is reporting another person's comment? And they said, no, we don't take the race of the speaker or the race of the person posting or the race of the person they're posting to into account. And I was like, well, but you have that information, you use that information for advertising. And they said, well, we use it for advertising, we don't use it for this. And for me, that was like a light bulb moment of saying these are decisions that are being made by people. All of these moderation decisions were used by AI, but ultimately a human being was making these choices. And I was like, these are choices made by an institution about what they value, what they don't value. And that is feeding into this algorithmic system that is controlling much of the speech in America. And it was this light bulb moment for me of saying, hey, this is something that's happening and it's happening everywhere, but ultimately these are it's not magic. It's not like computers doing things on their own. These are decisions being made by people, sometimes thoughtfully and sometimes thoughtlessly. That's creating these inequities.
So I've just always been really interested in criminal legal system reform and also in speech equity. Since I was a kid, I went to high school in the south side of Chicago, and I felt very surveilled often because because my friends were. And then as I became a public defender and then went to work for Aclu, and particularly did a lot of work with sex workers who are some of the most surveilled people in society, I just really realized how much AI was used to not only enhance surveillance on those folks, but also how investments in AI were really used to divest from the communities that most needed them to enhance and increase the size of the carceral state.
Thank you so much for all the panelists for answering logical questions. Now we are going to take a brief pause, and if the audience has any questions before we go into more specific questions for each panelist, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand if you're in person. Yes.
My name is Yas Sayed. I'm one of the commissioners of the Immigration Affairs Commission in the city of Jersey City. I'm very new to both of these, the justice system. I'm not an attorney or I'm not an artificial engineer. So my questions are basic. First to Aaron. Has the justice system officially accepted AI as a part of the system? If they have, where do you see the challenges the system will have, the justice system will have from the AI? My question to Professor Jarrett is, if with the development of AI and the impact it will have on the social system besides the justice system, what do you see one day, the advantages and the disadvantages of the development of the AI over the whole society? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I'm not sure I have a universal view of the justice system, but I know that algorithms are used in many places in the justice system. They've been used to set amounts for bail. They've been used to determine, when someone goes into prison, what level of security they get. I have done a lot of reporting about predictive policing algorithms, which are algorithmic systems that tell police officers where the places and times that crime is most likely to occur, and then they would send officers to those locations. And in all of these systems, when they've been looked at, they've often found bias. So I think it is something that is becoming, that it already exists, it's becoming more prevalent. And I think, when you talk to a lot of people in the criminal justice system about it, the thing that they will say is that, they're often civil servants, they're government employees, they're often budget constraints. So they're saying, we have limited resources. How do we deploy these resources in the most efficient way? And if you have a computer system that can tell people, that says, hey, do this versus do that, it takes the individual agency off of a public official, but at the same time, gives them an idea into something that might be hard for them, or they might be concerned about their own individual biases. And if they have a lot of trust in that technical system, they can then say, well, I'm not being biased here. I'm letting this system, and this system just uses the data. So, yeah.
Thank you for the question. Just so I'm understanding it correctly, so your question is about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages that'll come from the further development of AI? Am I getting that right? Okay. I guess because so much of my work is involved with the criminal legal system, and before that, the child welfare system, Logan was talking about, it's really hard to say what some of the advantages will be, because so much of the system is based upon inequity. And because AI, as Aaron already noted, it doesn't really challenge the underlying inequities within that system. So it just builds upon, what's already happened. And so, I briefly, not to be super long-winded, but, I talked about the gang database for a moment before. Well, one of the problems with the gang database is, even if they are using AI now, all the inputs that went into what that database is founded upon were based upon racist assumption of crimes, and that it just existed for years. And so what are some of the advantages? I mean, I think that there could be advantages if there were a shifting in what some of our priorities are. If we wanted to use AI to attack some of the underlying issues that lead people to be justice involved, like poverty, maybe there could be some advantages. However, even then, I think when something relies upon tracking individuals, attacking the fundamental privacy that people have, I am, not to sound like a complete Luddite, but I am really apprehensive about saying that there will be like advantages, although, it's something that's gonna happen, whether I wanted to or not. So I should probably think about that further. Thank you.
Professor, do you think it will have a major impact on employment of this time? Development impact on the jobs market. The intelligence is developed to a stage when it will be very prevalent, will have impact on the people workforce.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest collateral consequences to criminal legal system involvement right now is having one of the biggest collateral consequences to criminal legal system involvement is employment prospects. I mean, that's one of the first things that people are asked when they get even an arrest, is how it's going to impact their ability to get a job in the future. I think that so AI, in the sense that it increases the carceral state, certainly has an impact on the jobs market. We're already seeing certain private employers be able to pull different information from people, which is certainly having an impact on people's jobs prospects. And those adverse consequences are really concentrated in Black and brown communities with the Black and brown people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the questions. We are going to continue to have these conversations, but first we're going to go into more specific questions that we have prepared for each panelist.
Thank you so much, Gia. So we will be starting off with Mr. Trujillo. And I also would like to thank you for bringing up the idea of bad data in, bad data out. I know that's one of the biggest sayings in Encode Justice, so thank you so much for that. But to start off, I understand that you work a lot with youth, especially in the juvenile justice system, and it's no secret today that you are overwhelmingly online, specifically on social media platforms such as Instagram. And recently, a study came out showing that 79% of personal data that includes younger children's data are collected by them, and some of those data include search histories, location, contact information, and are sold to third parties. And there's also ways that law enforcement and justice departments can acquire warrants to review these data. And so I want to ask, with these data collection trends, do you see issues specifically within the juvenile justice system with AI systems that might use data from these social media companies, whether that be Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or do you just see any correlation with the juvenile justice system and social media? It was asking if you see any correlation.
The juvenile justice system and social media. Absolutely. I promise I won't start every answer off with the gang database, but that might be a lie because it's really just the best example of how AI has really been weaponized against low-income communities in New York. And so, and a lot of that weaponization has really been concentrated among young Black and brown kids. Whether in social media, people just put everything on there. But for young kids, particularly right now, there is, the mayor is really concerned about drill rap, which is just another genre of rap. And, the NYPD has a collection of officers whose entire job is just to monitor people's social media presence. And if you are a kid that just wants to express themselves, as has been a real issue in New York and nationally, be careful what lyrics you put on. The question is about AI, but how do police officers determine which kids are going to look at? Well, it's the inputs that they put into the gang database. And then there are algorithms for which kids should we monitor. And those algorithms are again, not really based on justice. They're ultimately based upon poverty, they're based upon race, they're based upon neighborhood, which is usually a collection of both of those things.
Thank you.
Thank you for reading. By the way, for the audience, please do keep in mind that we have opening time for audience questions as well. So just think of those and have them written down. I wanted to ask a question specifically to Ms. Giuliani about, you mentioned this, but just for context, AI is data driven and AI bias is also data driven. So data privacy, data collection is incredibly connected to the biases that we're talking about today. I wanted to ask you about your role in the ACLU and your role within the data privacy movement. This is slightly diverting from the topic, but we wanted to ask you about your role in passing the USA Freedom Act, which from my vague understanding is about undoing some of the bad effects of the Patriot Act. So, and how do you think that plays into overall data privacy, data collection, and its connection with algorithms?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So I think for those of you who might not track this act many years ago, it was really, it was passed by Congress, and it was passed by Congress in the wake of the Snowden revelations. And I think what really motivated a lot of the reforms was disclosures that showed that the NSA had essentially been collecting call records for basically everybody inside the United States. So that's who someone called, what time they called them, how often they called them. And often they were able to build out people's social networks, right? So they know you called your mother talked to X, Y, and Z person, and sort of have a sense of what communities actually existed. And so I think that with the USA Freedom Act, to me, there were a couple of lessons that came out of that. The first was there were a lot of good things about the USA Freedom Act, but I think one hidden thing that I didn't fully appreciate the impact it would have in the long term was that it imposed transparency requirements. Far from perfect, a lot more needs to be done, but I do fundamentally believe the more and more that I do this work that having that kind of public transparency at least gives advocates and others who think that something wrong is happening a clear set of facts to make their case. The second, I think, lesson learned that really came out of this, and I think this applies to almost all of the technologies I've worked on in my career, is that we often don't measure efficacy, right? Like we have, police departments across the country who use face recognition. We don't have any data that it even works, that it's even making communities safer, that it's even contributing to, prosecutions that people think are the right prosecutions to have. And so, with the USA Freedom Act, a really strong piece of data we were able to produce was that the program didn't actually work, right? It didn't actually help stop terrorism, contrary to, I think, what some people said. And I guess the last, I would say, lesson learned from that experience was to get something done, we really had to build a coalition across the political spectrum. And that's obviously not the same with every issue. It depends on what you're looking at. But I think that in looking at these issues, we have to sort of be able to speak to common values that can unite people who might have different perspectives, whether it's the criminal justice system or immigration, but I think largely believe on the kind of world we want to live in. And that was, I think, a lesson in how you actually get something done, even if what got done wasn't necessarily everything that I wanted.
I think that's an incredible answer. There's so many intersections between technology policy, and the cases are so similar because currently there's a bill in the Senate called the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and it tries to do something similar to what you did with the USA Freedom Act, unveiling transparency, requiring companies to produce impact assessments on the algorithms that they use. And like you mentioned, it currently has a lot of Democratic sponsors and not a lot of Republican sponsors, and appealing to the common values of transparency, privacy, and individual freedom is extremely important when lobbying for technology policy. And the USA Freedom Act is one of the precedents for that. So thank you for your work with that. Okay, now I'm going to pass it up to Chua for more questions.
Thank you so much. So
think my line of questioning to be focused on Mr. Stapleton. So to start off, just for those who aren't really familiar with it, can you explain what the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, or AFST, is?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So the Alligator Family Screening Tool, this is like most of my PhD work is on this specific algorithm. It's an algorithm used in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. So this is where Pittsburgh is. And it uses government data on families who are reported to Child Protective Services. It predicts the likelihood that a child within that family will be placed in foster care within 2 years. And the algorithm essentially assists workers in determining which families to screen in for investigation or not. Right. So the algorithm is not making decisions on its own. It's the workers, but the algorithm informs the workers. And then lastly, the AFST uses a slew of government data like juvenile justice data, probation data. They used to use welfare records. They use public behavioral health records, as well as demographics, past Child Protective Services history, to make its predictions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And just following up with that, can you sort of discuss the papers that you've written with child welfare and AI and the racial disparities that you found with AFST?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, I have two main papers. I have a couple papers on this publications. One is came out in May, was looking at essentially an independent audit of this specific algorithm. This algorithm has been touted as, addressing a lot of inequities, racial inequities in the child welfare system, which is a very racially biased, racially disparate system. Our findings in auditing the algorithm found that the algorithm was making much more racially disparate recommendations than the decisions that the workers were actually making, which is totally contrary to what the local county government had been saying for years. And another secondary finding of that first publication was that essentially the workers who were using this algorithm disagreed with the predictions that the algorithm was trying to make. So the algorithm is predicting foster care placement within 2 years. The workers were predicting much more immediate things, or not even predicting things at all, right, to make their decisions. So any evaluations of the algorithm and the workers based on accuracy is faulty. And so like this comparison between algorithms versus workers is a little bit fraught. And the second maybe publication was more broadly talking with families, most of them in New York actually, who were like about their concerns with these algorithms in the child welfare system. And I'll be brief, but suffice to say that the child welfare system is an incredibly important system to look at for anybody who's interested in, criminal justice reform or abolition. Everyone saw, in Texas and Florida, investigating families of trans children, right? It's an incredibly racist system, and so a lot of the families that we talked to said, "Look, the system is fraught up from top to bottom, and using algorithms really replicates a lot of the racist or carceral logics and practices that exist in the system today."
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. I think that the child welfare system is something that is sometimes overlooked when we have discussions about the criminal justice system and algorithms and things like that. So thank you for bringing that up. And just to follow up with your paper about how child welfare workers reduce racial disparities in algorithmic decisions. So that paper found that a human algorithm collaboration resulted in less racial disparity in screen-in rates. So as technology continues to develop, what do you see as a feasible role for algorithms in such a human AI sort of partnership within the child welfare system?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the human AI collaboration, to me is like a slight misnomer. I'm not completely sold on it. Essentially, in the case of the AFST, right, it's the algorithm is informing workers who then ultimately make the decisions. So there's some sort of collaboration going on. When we talk to the workers who actually use the algorithm, what we found is that most of them are disagreeing with the algorithm. They don't really like the algorithm. So it's a lot of like not very informative collaboration. A lot of the collaboration turns out to be CPS administrators and leadership essentially trying to influence or control on the ground decision making through this algorithm. So a lot of the collaboration that I see is kind of fraught. And honestly, I think that any kind of predictive algorithms used to predict things about individual people and make decisions about individual people are fraught from the beginning. What I would think is maybe a better use of these kinds of algorithms is to inform policy at a higher level. And you could run empirical simulations or things like this. Those are possible uses that might be less bad, I guess, but using predictive algorithms on individual people is limited, biased, often racist.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your answers. Definitely learned a lot more about like the criminal justice system in terms of child welfare. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to pass it off to Marissa now.
Thank you so much, Tor. Our next question is for Mr. Simkin. So I wanted you to discuss what role investigative journalism and news coverage plays in uncovering algorithmic injustices.
I think a lot of the role of journalism in uncovering algorithmic injustices is just simply creating a group of people who has the motivation and time and resources to just spend time looking and to try to figure out what is going on in these systems. And then when something is going on in the system that's problematic, is then, expose it. I think I'll talk really quickly about an example of this. Is a number of years ago, I was working on a story about cross-check, which is a system that was set up to essentially combat voter fraud. And it was basically the way it works is it was an algorithm, an algorithmic system that would match up if there were people with the same name in two different states that were both registered to vote, and it would check that and then essentially go out and then try to encourage the election officials to say, hey, maybe this is the same person, you should kick them off your voter rolls, we don't want them voting twice. And there was a lot of criticism of this system, that it was essentially a way to get voter disenfranchisement. And I started looking into it. And as this is the thing that I think some other speakers said, is that when I reached out to all of these different state and local election officials, they were like, this system is terrible. We use it and we contribute data to it, but it's wrong most of the time. It takes all of this effort for us to double check things, and we don't even use it. So I had spoken, reached out to the secretaries of state in most of the states that have used it, and at least half of them were like, we don't actually use this system. It's a waste of we think it's a waste of our time. And to me, that created a story that was like, hey, this system it's a waste of government money. It's creating all these negative externalities and tons of cybersecurity problems. But the role of the journalist there was to go in to ask those questions, was to go up and call every single secretary of state that was in a state that participated in this program and say, hey, what do you think about it? And then eventually, after asking enough of those questions, you could go out and then write an article and say, this is not a good use of anyone's time or money. And I think that's the point of journalism here, is especially as a lot of the technical expertise is sitting in academia, sitting in it's sitting in industry. It's to go and look at the inputs and the outputs of that system and see how it's affecting people.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simkin. That was extremely insightful. Now I will be passing it to Gia to ask a question.
Thank you so much. And again, we will have Q&A in the future. So please keep thinking about the questions you want to ask the panelists, including the people on Zoom. This question is for Albert Fonsecan. Later today, we will be conducting a workshop on artificial intelligence in policing and surveillance, which all participants of this event will be a part of. But considering your expertise in tools like predictive policing and facial recognition technology, we were hoping to give our audience in person and online a snippet from the topic itself. That being said, how does algorithmic justice relate to overall police reform, especially considering the widespread and possibly harmful usage of tools like predictive policing and facial recognition technology?
Yeah, happy to speak to all of this. And I think I will echo Jared in talking about the gang database, because I think that is emblematic of how you can't have abolition without abolishing mass surveillance. Because when New York City was forced through years of litigation to scale back its stop and frisk program, what it immediately did was it scaled up the gang database and used this digital stop and frisk as a substitute. So when we look at facial recognition, when we look at predictive policing, when we look at these algorithmic systems, they're a way that in the rare cases that, you know, we are able to push back on police budgets and are able to scale back the level of over policing of BIPOC communities, that then police departments just respond by using technology to augment the impact that their officers have. And I think Camden, New Jersey is a really horrifying model of that, where you saw supposed reform of their police department, and then in response you saw the mass adoption of mass surveillance systems, all of which bake in tremendous amount of invasive tracking, tremendous amount of bias, and really compound this threat. Because when you think about everything that makes the power dynamics of the criminal justice system so corrupt and so indefensible, the fact that power is consolidated, that it's opaque, that people don't have a meaningful chance to push back in so many cases, that you see all of these abuses, AI just makes that worse. And so I think, especially with things like facial recognition, you have to recognize that judges aren't allowing this in. You don't have a court system that's actually adjudicating it. You just have police departments going off on their own using it. And oftentimes those impacted don't even know that they've been the target of these systems. So it is a situation today that when I was in high school, I would read about in science fiction. I would think about with philosophers like Kafka as just this absurd future. And that's our present reality today. So, it's bad tech being used by, misguided departments at best, and really having a devastating impact.
Thank you so much for answering that question, especially when you talked about the unawareness of many communities that this is affecting their everyday life, even without knowing it. Now we will go into questions for Dr. Trujillo.
So Dr. Trohan, I wanted to ask, sorry, the paper is a little bit sorry. I wanted to ask you how could you explain your role as a could you please explain the Women in AI Collective and your leadership role there in more depth?
Did you ask me about women in AI ethics?
Yes. Could you explain that a little bit more in depth and your role with it?
Okay, so it's a collective that was started by Mia Dant, who is a fierce leader, in the responsible tech space. So essentially, she'd been working with big tech for a long time, realizing how they're having that approach of move fast, break things, and not putting any algorithmic accountability into place. And at the same time, she realized the marginalized of women in the ethical or responsible tech space. So essentially what we do is try to empower women by highlighting their contributions, giving them a forum to empower them to speak up and be an essential stakeholder and have an equitable seat at the table when we're talking about responsible tech. So it entails public awareness and advocacy, and it's in terms of hosting events like the one you're hosting today. also, there is a whole a directory in which anyone can self-nominate themselves, where people can highlight the 6 dimensions of AI ethics that they're working on. So essentially, to be able to provide a resource to all these corporate tech folks who say that they're not enough qualified women to even be invited to speak or to be hired. So essentially just giving them a forum.
Thank you so much for the answer. I think it's amazing that you're able to give a forum to those underrepresented within AI ethics for big tech companies. Now I'll pass it over to Trujillo for question.
Thank you for that. Just give me 1 second. So I actually had a question for Mr. Simkin again. Mr. Khan mentioned predictive policing as one of the more prominent parts of algorithms within criminal justice. And I know you wrote a groundbreaking article, collaborated with other DeMarca reporters about Predpol. Could you just elaborate on that and how you were able to investigate the biases within the data? Because I think one of the main things that even people in the chat are mentioning is that all of this bias is driven by data. So if you could just elaborate on the investigation and how that happened and what you think we could improve on in terms of data.
Yeah, so last year I was part of a team, it was a collaboration between the DeMarca and Gizmodo, looking at the predictive policing company, Predpol. And the investigation was based off of a data set that a data reporter at Gizmodo had discovered, linked off of the LAPD's website. And this data set was a list of predictions for produced for dozens of police departments around the country by Predpol. And if you're not familiar, what Predpol does is it ingests crime report data from a police department and then creates a set of predictions about the places and times that particular crimes are most likely to occur. We found this data linked off of the LAPD's website. Do not think they meant to make it public, but we downloaded it and then did analysis looking at where the predictions in each city were directing officers. And what we found, I think, to most of the people in this room and watching this on Zoom, is probably not going to be particularly surprising, but we were able to prove it that it was directing people, officers overwhelmingly to areas, to look to areas where low income people lived, to areas where Black and Latino people live. And doing so in cities across the country. But to me, I think the thing, again, that was really interesting was, at the end of the reporting process, we took this data to all of the police departments whose data that we had, or was produced for them. And we asked them, like, what do you use this for? What do you think about the system? And it was really shocking, the number of police departments who said, yeah, we used this for a little while, but didn't think it was particularly useful. We thought that, it's just, we're in a small town, we know where the crime is, like it's essentially automating away our autonomy, which to me, I thought was a really interesting way of phrasing that and a way of framing that even inside of police departments, where you would see these police officers saying, I feel the same control over, my life is being controlled, so it has to be controlled by an algorithm in a way that's a much of like a flip of, the communities that are being surveilled and being policed by this algorithm.
Thank you so much for that answer. And it's a really interesting perspective that you provided about how law enforcement officers also felt a little iffy about using predictive policing algorithms. My next question, actually, Sheila, would you like to ask?
Yeah, so this is a question for Nima.
So from lobbying meetings and webinars, we've seen that a lot of professionals in the field of AI ethics and technology policy, including yourself, of course, have worked in both the public and the private sector. So what motivated you to shift from your work at the ACLU to Twitter?
So I don't know that I have the best answers to that question. I guess for me personally, what originally drove my decision was impact, right? I wanted to work someplace where I thought I could have an impact. And two, I worked in the advocacy space for a long time and I wanted to sort of see things from the inside. And so that was sort of what drove that sort of shift is feeling like I wanted to have an impact. But also, you learn a totally different skill set. I think sometimes when you're working inside the private sector, you are privy to information you might not have on the outside. And often you have the ability to, I think, influence decisions from the inside in a way that's just different from when you're an advocate.
Yeah, totally. That inside outside sort of connection is definitely super important in terms of both AI and of course the criminal justice system. So thank you so much.
Thank you. The next question will be for Jared. So I understand that you worked a lot on bill reform, and within AI, one of the biggest technologies that's used is the algorithms used to see how much likely a defendant will recommit a crime. And so I want to ask you, how did you see that those algorithms play a role while you were working on bill reform? Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. I mean, even just seeing articles right now that'll say this person was released on bail, so this person like went free. That's not how the system works. Bail is something that is set usually pre-arraignment or at arraignment. And even in a case where someone does not have bail set, that does not mean that their case is over, particularly if it's for a felony. So I just want to give that little bit of grounding. But so as far as New York's bail reform fight went, really, when we talked about AI and Compass in particular, that several states use, and Compass is a program, an AI program that is supposed to be predictive about what is someone's likelihood of reoffending. Compass is even used in certain jurisdictions to see in sentencing. So once a person has been adjudicated guilty, determining how long they would spend in a prison to the extent that people can, because mandatory minimums are a thing. But our biggest employment, I guess, about Compass during New York's bail reform fight was showing how inaccurate it was, showing how it didn't really predict rearrest rates. And I would even argue that predicting a rearrest rate versus a conviction rate are very different, because an arrest does not mean guilt. Oftentimes convictions don't mean guilt, but different panel. But so really that was a lot of what our fight was in New York, is just showing that in all of these instances where Compass and different AI models to predict dangerousness have been used, like the dangerousness usually just means how far someone is from being a middle-class white person. The further that they are from that standard, the more dangerous they are, the more likely they were to be held pre-trial. And the last thing I just want to say with it, which I think is so important for New York, because New York does not have a dangerousness standard because of the work of so many directly impacted people. When we think about public safety and community safety, incarcerating someone pre-trial, particularly someone, who isn't factually guilty, but anyone, it doesn't enhance community safety, because you destabilize that person, you take them out of their jobs, you take them out of their treatment programs, you take them away from the anchors that they have in the community that actually keep them more stable and keep people away from doing criminalized behavior. That was longer than I planned to speak. I'm sorry, but hopefully that was cool.
Thank you so much.
Now I'll pass it on to Gia.
I will wait for whatever this noise is making to stop work. Okay. Now we're going to go into audience questions, and if we have time after the audience questions, we're going to go into more of the specific questions because we do have a lot of those. So first off, does anyone in person have questions for the panelists? Yes. Yes. Sorry, one second.
Say that they have.
Can you repeat it?
Sorry, okay. I feel like, okay, with the new generation, a lot of us are on social media, and I think even older generations are now more inclined to be on Facebook and Instagram. And Facebook has always had, and Meta in general, has always had so many problems with data privacy. So how would you recommend that youth and just people in general can help to protect their data a bit more and to stop it from being used for things like you mentioned, being put into databases or being tracked in other ways?
Who is this question directed to?
I guess you guys both kind of mentioned it, so whoever wants to talk about it.
I can say something really briefly. So just really briefly, I'll say for young people, when they're to use encrypted means of communication whenever it's possible. So that means using Signal. I don't know that WhatsApp has end-to-end encryption, but yeah, to the extent that people can to use encryption. But also when you're on social media to recognize that like there is no such thing as there's no such thing as private communication anymore. It's just not the world that we live in. I mean, you know, when I was a teenager, I could like mess up and like my poor MySpace followers might care, but that's just not the world we live in anymore. And you know, what can young people do to protect themselves? I hope that someone can answer that better than I can, but I think the biggest thing is to recognize that anything that you do, like you're not just doing it, even if your account is on private, you're not just doing it for your followers, you are doing it for anyone in the world that wants to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of echo that sentiment. I mean, I wish I had a better answer other than, you know, lobby your lawmakers for better data privacy legislation. But I think at this point, it's really difficult for individuals to kind of make a dent here. There are certain things you can do. For example, like you can use, you know, if you're using a web browser, use one that is like fairly highly privacy sensitive. But I think, you know, at the same time, you should just kind of assume that, especially if it's, you know, the person who is interested in getting your information is the government, they have subpoena power. It's often difficult to stay completely private.
Thank you. We will be taking a question from the Zoom audience, and then we will do another in-person question. Okay, so one of the questions states, could someone explain more about the impact of AI with reproductive care for Black and Brown people? And I think this is addressed to any of the panelists. So if you just want to unmute or raise your hand to discuss, please. Dr. Showan, can you actually address this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question, especially when we talk about reproductive care for BIPOC women, right? There have been a lot of, some of the research that I have seen, there are cultural barriers to how people of color approach the subject of, you know, reproductive care. In certain geographies, there are biases against young women or unmarried women or women who have been single for a long time to even approach healthcare facilities. And also the level of regulation, or I say there is no level of regulation currently. So again, depending on which healthcare facility you're going and where you're going, the kind of data that is being collected and how the data is saved and supervised is very obscure. So I would just say it's a very murky, scenario. I don't know of any vetted resources where there are collected data sets that could be used, which have the consent of BIPOC women to perform or train such AI currently.
Thank you, Dr. Shawan.
You're welcome.
Now we will take another in-person question. And please make sure to address who this question is for.
So, I mean, listening to all the examples that you've been giving, the first thing was about the insurance that's actually certain, and then we read about it all the time in New York Times that certain, group of people are marginalized, but they end up paying more for car insurance or more rents or whatever they may be. And then you also mentioned the cross-check program. And then the third one was actually with the AI for all the police departments within the country. So it seems like everyone agrees, yes, there's a problem, but we don't use it. We don't listen to it because that's the human element to it, right? When you really talk to the people who actually do the cross-check, or you talk to the police departments who are actually doing the job, they're like, yeah, we don't really look at it. It's just really doesn't work. There's a disconnect there. So it's almost like, yes, we just spent millions of dollars implementing an AI program, but really the people who are actually doing the work, they don't really believe in it. So at what point are people going to think about, you know what, maybe there's something to it. Maybe we actually have to change this. We have to listen to the people who are actually doing the cross-check to make that change. So it's actually a better collaboration between AI and quote unquote, the human element to it. So my question is to Aaron, is like, have you encountered anyone from the sort of like the people who've implemented the AI program, whoever that may be, the powers to be, that will say, you know what, there's something to it. You're right, and we should actually create a better collaboration.
Let me know if people can't hear me over this loud AC system. So I think one of the things is you have to be, if you're making an AI and people are using these systems, it's often the key is being very deliberate about the problem that you're trying to solve and how you are solving that problem. So I think in doing all this research and stuff about predictive policing, the idea, I mean, the core idea around predictive policing is that it takes the ideal is that should be taking the individual bias out of the decision of where a police officer should patrol. So it's that idea of saying you have the old idea of a police officer, and they're like, well, I'm just going to go patrol around the Black neighborhood because that's where the crime is. And the idea behind something like predictive policing is saying, well, maybe it's not the entire neighborhood, maybe it's just this block, maybe it's this corner. And it, and ultimately it has a lot of problems, but maybe.
Lisa told me about a really good coffee shop. Sounds
but maybe the issue here is that the problem with predictive policing is the policing. Like maybe there are other things that you could do with that data. And I'm reminded of a system that was used in Newark a number of years ago with a thing called risk terrain modeling. And that's similar to kind of predictive policing, but it basically creates maps of hotspots of where crime is most likely to occur. And it fills in more data. It's like, it's happening in a location. What are those locations? So in Newark, they found, okay, this is happening in a lot of abandoned lots, right? And these are the places where there's likely to be a lot of crime is in these abandoned lots and abandoned buildings. So they took, there were groups that took this data and they gave it to housing nonprofits who were developing affordable housing and it helped that group reprioritize which lots it wanted to develop, because it was saying, yes, we are going to help housing here, but we can use this data about where crime is most likely to occur, and then also get rid of those environmental sources of crime that could then create better outcomes for everybody. So I think a lot of times it's thinking very critically about, yes, you have this data and you have this AI system, but thinking about, maybe the information that maybe the thing you're using that system for is not the ideal or only way you can use that system. And, you know, sometimes if the old adage is all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but like sometimes you have to think about other ways to use the hammer.
Thank you so much. Now we are going to take a question from the chat. And again, the person who submitted the question did not specify who it was for, but they stated, can explainable AI or XAI be integrated with criminal justice to see if AI is indeed beneficial? Will XAI come soon in CJ? And this is actually to Dr. Suri. Oh, wait. Oh, this is from Dr. Suri. Never mind. So this is to any panelists. Actually, yeah.
I'm happy to respond to this a bit because one of the things that we have to recognize when it comes to the criminal justice system is we don't track crime in the United States. We track arrests, we track policing encounters, but every aspect of the criminal justice system is so warped by bias that we don't have a actual reflective data set that we can pull from when we're building these systems. And so any of these systems, no matter what approach you take, we run into the same problem where you're feeding it in this highly distorted picture of what reality looks like. And so it's going to give you back a really distorted answer. And Rashida Richardson, who's an advisor to FTC Chair Lena Khan's written a great law review piece that I linked to in the chat, which goes into all of the sort of like systemic barriers to doing this, regardless of the specific AI model you use. So again, I'm taking the proud Luddite position.
Thank you. Now we'll take another in-person question.
Not exactly sure which panelists I'm directing this to, but I think it's more of a legal question. And some of that has to do with whether or not there is the possibility of some sort of extended liability or accountability through a legal lens, whether that's civil or even maybe criminal, for maybe it's the developers of these algorithms, maybe it's the inappropriate use of them. So that's kind of one part of my question. And the other part of my question is also legally related, but it has to do with the admissibility of this evidence. Because those two standards, one of which, when it comes to expert testimony, is that it's generally accepted. That's the Fry standard. And then the other standard is doubt, meaning that it's reliable, essentially, right? But if the data is flawed, then it's not reliable. But it may have the impression of reliability, and thus it ends up being admissible. But then also it's generally accepted if everybody's using it. And so I guess that then circles right back to the potential for expanded liability for the misuse of this.
Please feel free to unmute if you would like to answer this question, or raise your hand if you're close. Okay, yes, Nima Julia.
Sure. So I'm happy to take part of that. I think the answer to the first part of your question about sort of legal remedies is it depends. So within the law, there's existing civil rights laws. Some of those laws are strongest around things like housing, credit, and employment. And so to the extent that there is an algorithm that someone has developed or used that could create sort of discriminatory impacts in those areas, I think there's potentially a civil case that can be brought. Obviously, these are things that are still being sorted out in the courts. Probably one of the most recent high-profile examples is when HUD sued Facebook for discriminatory ads. And they looked both at sort of how Facebook allowed ad targeting, but one of the things that they also included in their lawsuit was how the algorithm acted and whether it sort of delivered ads in a discriminatory way. So I think that those are probably the areas where it's strongest. There could obviously be other laws at play too, whether that's duty of care or other specific laws to other sectors. But I think one of the challenges is that these things are still getting worked through the courts, and it creates, I think, a lack of clarity, both for people bringing those lawsuits, but even for companies to assess their own risk.
Thank you so much for answering that. We are going to take one more question from the chat, and then all of the additional questions that have been put in the chat, we are going to email to the panelists and they will answer them, and we'll send that in the follow-up email if that's okay with the panelists, because we do have limited time. So this question is directed towards Albert. Can such a data be collected? Please shed light on what are the challenges to collect such data.
I think that was referencing the a collection of unbiased crime data to make a predictive policing system possible. And I haven't seen it would take a complete reinvention of the criminal justice system and the policing system in America as we know it to collect that sort of data. I'll give you an example. I went to a prep school in New York City. And according to the NYPD data, no one has ever used an illicit substance in that school because no one's ever been arrested for an illicit substance in that school. But you go to a public school a few blocks away, and according to NYPD data, lots of people have used illicit substances because the police actively are policing students there who are often majority BIPOC students, lower income students. And so the data set we get on drug usage shows that this prep school, which I know for a fact was rampant with kids using illicit substances, was very different. And that repeats over and over again, where the official data we draw from is very distorted. And we can definitely do these more limited studies to look at the underlying incidence rates of things like drug use and find out, oh, this data is highly non-representative. But it's very different to go from that to creating a wholesale like synthetic data set or some sort of much broader data set that captures not just all of the broader crime patterns, but captures it in with enough granularity to actually be meaningful in training some sort of predictive system. So I think that there really isn't the infrastructure to collect the data we would need to build these systems. And even if we had that, I think there would be a lot of legal and philosophical reasons to be fearful about doing so.
Thank you so much for all of the knowledgeable questions from the panelists for this past 2 hours now. And thank you again. And we are going to go into our networking / break for the people online so people can have some rest for the computers. And then at 3 p.m., please be back by 3 p.m. We're going to continue with our workshop as well as general discussion. And the panelists are welcome to stay. But again, we are so happy that you were able to come, and we are so thankful. So thank you so much. And again, the questions that were not able to be answered, we're going to send to the panelists and they will answer them in the follow-up email. So please look out for that. Thank you so much again. And yeah. Hello, everyone. We are going to begin again. Sorry for the echo. We are fixing that right now. Okay, so now we're going to begin with a short slideshow to go over some definitions about algorithmic justice and go over some case studies and do a general overbrief of how AI is affecting our world today. And I know that we learned a lot from the panelists, but this is a more summary. So then when we go into discussion, we have a better understanding of what to talk about. Yeah, so just a quick overview for what we're going to be doing at our workshop. So first off, we're going to do an introduction to artificial intelligence. So just like, what is artificial intelligence and how does it work? Sort of going into a deep dive into the roots of everything with AI. And then we're going to talk about intro to FRT. So FRT is facial recognition technology. So we're going to go and talk about how does this affect schools and policing and sort of its impact. And then the third thing that we're going to be doing is case studies. So just what is an example of how AI can people. And lastly, we're going to be talking about, of course, artificial intelligence within the criminal justice system. So that's just talking about how our risk assessment is going to be used in the criminal justice system and sort of just the main topic of our entire event. Yeah. So we're going to start off with the introduction.
So I'll be starting off with explaining what artificial intelligence itself is, and it's a broad topic, but I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. And to put it in the most simple terms, it's essentially a set of algorithms that try to mimic human behavior, and it can generally be put into two different categories. So there's narrow or weak AI, which refers to a type of AI where action is limited and they don't have the general intelligence that the other kind of AI has, which is artificial general intelligence or strong AI. And this kind of artificial intelligence is able to perform essentially any task or solve any given problem because it has similar intelligence to a human. And so how does AI work? And everyone has probably seen AI in their lives at some point, especially if you're on social media. And similar to how humans learn from their mistakes or from their past actions, they learn from patterns. And essentially these patterns are generally data that are inputted from the user or the creator. And as some of the panelists mentioned, the data inputted, if it's biased, or if it's unfair, the data that's going to be outputted is obviously going to be biased as well. And so some examples of AI in our everyday lives would be the TikTok algorithm. So if you have TikTok and let's say you come across a video that you like, and you like the video, then the TikTok algorithm will show you more videos similar to it. But if you just scroll past it, then it wouldn't show anything similar to it. And if you go as far as blocking the user or as clicking on the don't show me similar videos button, then it will completely, the AI will realize that you aren't interested in the videos similar to that. And the Netflix algorithms work similar as well. So if you watch a TV show the whole way through and give it a high rating, Netflix will also give recommendations of shows that are similar. And so Shreya will now talk about a more specific type of AI, facial recognition.
So I wanted to discuss examples of facial recognition technology. Before that, we have to define facial recognition. Facial recognition is basically a biometric surveillance technology that uses biometrics to map facial features in a photograph to a database of known faces. It has the ability to identify an individual in a photo or video, including in real time. And it's used in many environments, including within schools and by law enforcement, like we discussed during the panel. It has been deployed widely as a tool of surveillance, and it's used by countries, including the United States, to identify protesters and surveil citizens, along with its biases, race, numerous ethical concerns about privacy and equity. The next slide. discusses specific examples. So I wanted to talk about schools and policing today. In schools, facial recognition technology is used to track students and visitors for various purposes like automatic attendance and security. FRT is generally embedded within CCTV cameras, which are in high abundance on school grounds across the country. And it has become a method to monitor student behavior rather than ensure security or attendance in schools, which is incredibly concerning. Within policing, facial recognition technology is used to identify victims of crimes, help sort faces and photos for forensic evidence, and for investigating leads, and to verify the identities of inmates before they are released from prison. Changes in pose, illumination, expression, and other factors make FRT less accurate, resulting in the loss of evidence and inaccurate identification of possible suspects. And considering the important uses of facial recognition technology in schools and in policing, it's extremely concerning that evidence suggests that it'll erode individual privacy and disproportionately affect marginalized groups. In policing cases like with Niger Parks of Patterson, New Jersey, Robert Williams, and Michael Oliver of Detroit, Michigan. Those exemplify facial recognition technology's discriminatory aspects. And two of these cases were discussed by Marcia and I later on in the presentation. I'm going to pass it on to Gia.
So going more into what the issues with facial recognition are, there are a lot of racial biases. So there was a research study from MIT and Stanford in 2018, which presented that in their research experiment, 3 programs' error rates in identifying light-skinned white men were never worse than 0.8%, less than 1%. But for dark-skinned women, they jumped as high as 34%. ACLU also conducted a study on members of Congress using Amazon's facial analysis software called Recognition. And this software falsely matched 28 members of Congress with faces and mugshots. And the majority, or all of these members of Congress, were people of color. And these error rates increase with skin pigmentation, affecting people of color. And even the company's testing accuracy are biased. And they report the testing data sets used to gauge accuracy are 77% male and more than 83% white. Now, Marissa will discuss a real world story of an individual being impacted by these biases.
Thank you. This is the story of Robert Williams, a man who received a call from the Detroit police while he was at work telling him to turn himself in. He was confused and he thought it was a prank call. So he hung up, but when he got home, there was a police officer waiting to arrest him in front of his kids and his wife. He was wrongfully arrested for shoplifting by the Detroit Police Department in January of 2020. He was held overnight at a detention center and interrogated about a video of a black man at an upscale boutique where the police alleged that he committed a crime. But Williams was sure it was not him. This was actually one of the first people being wrongfully accused due to facial recognition. Now I'm going to pass it off to Shreya to talk a little bit more about Niger Parks, a case that happened in New Jersey, not too far away from us.
So Niger Parks is a resident of Patterson, New Jersey, which is a lower-income BIPOC dominated community, and he was accused of shoplifting and assaulting a police officer, which are felonies. Though there was no corroborating evidence, he had an alibi. He was 30 miles away at the time of the incident, except the evidence that police used to suspect him was his identification by facial recognition tech. He was in jail for 10 days, and he was denied bail after his first hearing because of a high recidivism rate due to his past arrest for simple drug possession generated by a risk assessment algorithm, which Jared talked about. These risk assessment algorithms when we're deciding bail prevent innocent people from, or just criminals even, from talking to their family just based on prior arrests. He was arrested for drug charges, which Obviously, the war on crime, or war on drugs and all of that targets Black and Brown communities. So this is a clear example of how risk assessment algorithms just reinforce already systemic racism within our criminal justice system and just overall.
Thank you, Shreya. So as you can see, both of these innocent people and their families suffered an immense amount of emotional and physical trauma because of facial recognition misidentifications. Williams's family witnessed his wrongful arrest, and Parks's family and loved ones had to see him had to be at the risk for a longer imprisonment. Claire Garvey, a lawyer at Georgetown University Center on Privacy and Technology, has written about problems within facial recognition technology. And she argued that low-quality search images, much like the image that was shown to Williams, from grainy surveillance videos should be banned, and the systems currently in use should be tested for accuracy and bias, which is completely true, and I wholeheartedly agree. And recent studies from MIT and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, have found that while facial recognition works well on white men, the results are less accurate for other demographics, in part because of the lack of diversity in the images used to develop the underlying databases. So these two entire cases prove that the technology is not clearly reliable, especially, again, because of these underlying biases. Now I'm going to pass it off to Tor to talk about the specifics, such as risk assessments.
Yeah, so next thing we're going to talk about are risk assessments. So risk assessments are essentially algorithms that look at a defendant's profile in order to predict their recidivism rate. So a recidivism rate refers to the possible chance of an individual's relapse into criminal behavior. So these algorithms take into account the defendant's economic status, their race, their gender, and as well as many other factors. But the key point here is that the recidivism rate created by these algorithms are then used by the judge in order to determine things like if a defendant should be incarcerated before the trial, what their sentence should be, what their bail should be, sort of things like that. So a lot of people believe that these algorithms are less biased than judges themselves because it's impossible for AI to have personal biases because it's technology, right? This is a common misconception actually, because number one, the individuals that create these algorithms can have implicit biases, which they can encode into their algorithms. That's one way that's one of the issues. And the other issue is sort of the garbage in, garbage out. A lot of the algorithms that are created are based off of biased and discriminatory databases. And so if you have biased data used to create the artificial intelligence, only biased data will be outputted. Right? So next, we're going to talk about some of the case studies.
So kind of like Tor mentioned, a lot of these examples can be seen in real life. For example, in 2016, Eric Loomis filed a case against Wisconsin for using correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions. Essentially, this program was called Compass, and it was used by the state of Wisconsin to figure out the rate and the chance of a previous offender reoffending. This risk assessment algorithm, unfortunately, just like many of the others that we've discussed today, has encoded biases within the system that don't allow it to be unbiased and essentially fair. His argument was that Compass used in determining his sentence violated his due process rights as the court assumed his gender as a part of the Compass algorithm, as well as the fact that his right to be sentenced on accurate information was infringed because of the lack of transparency about the program. Essentially two things. The program was based on faulty information and it wasn't transparent. This case and Loomis's argument highlights the main issues of risk assessment algorithms like Compass, as it places an unfair importance on variables that people can't control and that algorithms encode instead. Though the court ruled that Compass risk assessment did not violate Loomis's rights to due process, they did mandate a warning before the usage of such algorithms, essentially acknowledging that there is potential for these problems. That same year, ProPublica published an article revealing that embedded biases based on demographics within a Compass algorithm used in Broward County, Florida, found that a Compass program falsely flagged defendants, specifically Black defendants, as future criminals for very high rates. This is just because of their past recidivism rates that mislabeled white defendants. The program misidentified people simply based on their skin color and assumed that they would have a higher recidivism rate. As demonstrated, risk assessment algorithms have embedded biases that reinforce already existing discrimination in the criminal justice system, and instead are now used in vital court processes like bail hearings, sentencings, and painting civil rights risks as risks. I'll now pass it off to Gia to talk more about the discussion. Sorry. Now I'll actually mention that. So we're going to have 20 minutes of discussion time for the remainder of this panel and event. And this is essentially going to be a time for y'all to discuss the articles that we've previously shared, and as well as your thoughts on the panel that we've just had. Anything that you'd like to say about the criminal justice and AI systems, this would be a great time to do so. If you're on Zoom, we will be directing you to a breakout room with a facilitator who will guide the discussion on your own personal experiences and thoughts relating to AI and the criminal justice system. For those in person, we're going to be having these same conversations, but just in this room with our group facilitators over here leading the conversation. We'll also be sharing a document that leads you through these conversations in a follow-up email. So that way you can continue these conversations at home. It's essentially just a discussion guide. And we highly suggest that you do so and take these conversations out with discussions in your friends and families. On the next slide, there will be a link that will show a QR code essentially. It's also on your agendas that has the information for the resource document as well as the articles. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll now pass it off to the breakout rooms and send everybody into the discussions.